Digitizing Delmarva's heritage and traditions.
I guess the best way that we have learned about the origin of San Domingo is looking at our church history. And the church being Zion United Methodist Church, um, our records show that the church really started in 1850, but really the community goes back even before that, with James Brown being a free black coming to these parts. And we date James Brown back to a census that shows that he was really a free black man in these areas even as early as 1820, which we find to be very impressive. And it seems that the community actually grew around some efforts that he and his family did. And again, it's important for us to try to document our origin. And I guess I give a lot of credit to this to his great-grandson, Hubert Brown, who has studied the census even as 1820 and 1832, and 3 or 4 different census records. But anyway, when you look at the census of 1820, you see a lot of free blacks in this area. And it's important also to see their occupation. And many of them were seamen or mariners, as is recorded in the census. So we have James Brown coming here from the Caribbean. And obviously, we're not sure exactly where, but if you start, and so we say around 1820, we know that James Brown came here. We know that he went to Dorchester County to find a woman to marry. And her name was Mary. We also know that James Brown and his family flourished in this area. He became a landowner. His property is not too far from here. It's east of here, over by what's now the Shields Road off of North Twilley Road, was his family property. And our whole community then sort of emanates from that, and his sons and other free blacks that moved here that interface with his family. My own great-grandfather, John Quinton, married James Brown's granddaughter, Sarah, and that's how we're connected with James Brown. But anyway, the important thing that we say to the youth of the day is that the community actually was started with free blacks trying to find a place to live, and we sort of trace those families from James Brown. And then the church itself. The church was founded in 1850. It wasn't United Methodist Church at the time. It was referred to as Little Zion. And it has a rich history too, over close to now 200 years, but starting in 1850. It's important also to look at James Brown. James Brown actually was deceased before or around 1850 or shortly thereafter. And our records show that his sons actually were very prominent in the community as well as in the church. And the property in which the church actually stands was donated by one of his sons. I think his son was Bard Brown, and I forget the other son's name, who donated land for where the school originally stands, which we'll look at shortly. But it's from that community. The name San Domingo is important when we trace the history of the community. Unfortunately, so much is not known, but as we learned in school about the black struggle, African Americans in this country, we know there were many revolutions, and one revolution was in Haiti, in Santo Domingo, where blacks revolted, and one of the symbols they gave to whites was the revolution there, where they killed several whites. And San Domingo then was a message to whites to stay away from black settlements. And so we believe that revolution really is where the name San Domingo really came from. So many people settled in this area actually came from the Caribbean. We don't know if they really were from Haiti itself, but we know they were from the Caribbean. As I said in the census, we know they were sailors and mariners. So we believe they came from there and picked up the significance of their revolution and adopted the name of Santo Domingo to know it was a free settlement and a message to white people to stay away. And that seems to make sense to us in terms of what was occurring here. It's a significant community in terms of the number of people that are actually here. And it's kind of impressive to know that they were free even before the Civil War was over, and to know that the emphasis behind the revolution in San Domingo is picking up that name as a way for them to protect themselves in this area. And a lot of youth ask that question because it's hard to convey to the youth the significance of black people struggling even before the Civil War to retain their freedom and also to flourish. So they had to have some way to work together and to protect themselves from the whole institution of slavery and other people that would not like to see them flourish. So anyway, we believe that name is either from their origin or from the revolution itself, is used as a message to the white communities to leave them alone here in this community. And many of them probably were from Haiti. I don't know, I can only recall certain discussions from my father and other people that they knew of some people that maybe had ties to Haiti. But you can't, I can't verify that. It's only in what I've heard. I know one person was Mr. Sherman Brown, who lives not too far from here. When I was a teenager, I know Mr. Sherman Brown would talk a lot about going or knowing people who came from Haiti, but there's no way to verify that. So you only have to assume that many of them came on the waterways, to include my great-grandfather was a seaman who moved from the Caribbean. In talking about the area and the families that lived here, and I think it's important to talk about a spirit of cooperation and a sense of pride and ownership. And throughout my youth, that's really what was communicated to us. And I do not ever recall being in San Domingo where we really understood or knew or really thought of ourselves as being poor. And it's important to understand that from the economy standpoint, because the spirit of cooperation and helping each other overshadowed the economic status. It was more what you had to do to support the family structure and support the community, and people shared with each other what they had or helped each other to the degree that there was this spirit of cooperation. People knew that that was the way they survived, that's the way their parents survived, and that's what was communicated to us even when all of us lived at home. So you had everyone in the community knew everyone else. As expansive as it was, I didn't know of any family that I did not know. And so people knew where to go to, what household to go to help resolve some issue, whether they were working on an old vehicle, whether they were building a shed or a garage. There were carpenters here. There were people who drove wells. So it's just a matter of knowing who had the skills, and they shared that willingly to be able to survive together. When you look at what people worked, certainly a significant number of the people here worked on the farms in the outlying areas. And that was really important when I talked to youth about how people survived. It wasn't only that they worked, in my youth, we worked 10 hours a day on the local farms, either in the crops and whatever was grown. Most of these, we call them truck crops at the time, because there was vegetables and fruits that were picked and packaged and shipped off to up and down the East Coast, particularly New York, Philadelphia, and all. But the idea was that you knew you had a job. So in the summertime, in growing season, you were working on the farm 10 hours a day. But the important thing I say to you is, but that wasn't the end of the day, because after you finish your job, so to say, which outside the community, you then return to the community where most families had a garden plot. So you did those chores that were necessary for the family itself to have vegetables and food after you finished your 10 hours a day. So the economy, per se, it's better for me to say people did what they had to do to survive. Um, Certainly, nobody thought of themselves as being wealthy. It was more of a question of being self-sufficient and doing what you had to do to make ends meet. And that spirit really carried itself all through my adulthood, even going through colleges, was to do what you had to do to be sufficient to be successful. Having a job plus working at the house or in the community, either growing your vegetables, raising your own animals for your own food, as well as saving as much as you could from your job. I know that many of the men here, and women too, in this community when I was a teenager at all, I don't know of anybody here who did not work. They worked either in the community or outside. Most of them worked on the farms or in some either chicken factory or in a basket factory here in the local town of Sharptown, or in a canning house. But they still came back in the community and had their own chores. It was interesting too, even the women that did not work outside of the community, they were always busy within the community, whether it were sewing, taking care of children while other people worked. So you had this really, the only thing I can say is community spirit of helping each other to survive. The idea of an expanded or extended family, we didn't know what those terms meant at the time, but that's really what it was. I don't think there's anybody who was treated as a stranger. It was, we all knew what family we belonged to, and you could go to any place in the community and get some support, or you had the spirit of sharing and cooperation. So I think really, in a nutshell, that's how the people survived, and that's how they thought of themselves as being self-sufficient. I know my uncle had a little store. His name was Norman J. Brown, and well, I call him Uncle Norman, but his name was Norman. But the people that worked outside of the community, coming home would always, to me, I stayed with him a lot. I remember up till I was 10 years old, to stop by his store to pick up staples. He would have canned goods. He would have a block of cheese or this sort of thing, and he had kerosene that we called coal oil, and a gas pump. And invariably, people stopped by and get what they needed from him on their way coming home from work, either on a farm in a factory. And they didn't have money to pay, so he would maintain this ledger that he called a book. So he would tell me, just write it on the book. So he kept this book on what people owed him. And at the end of the week, then he would tell me, he said, well, don't worry about it. They'll just settle up. And that term settle up was what people came to know. So at the end of the week, end of the work week, when they came home from work, people would, quote, settle up with him being the store owner. Either they would do a bartering, they would bring him something, or they would pay him, or what have you. But anyway, and that terminology is really what they were comfortable with. They would settle their debt with him, whatever he had on that book, for what goods they used during the week, either bringing him other material to sell or simply pay him. So it's really the most important thing I would say in terms of the economy and how people live was a spirit of cooperation, working together, and that they were doing things together for the whole community to be successful. There's no sense of competition or getting ahead. It was, we had to do something together. Even working together for butchering animals or harvesting crops, whatever it was, you had this cooperative spirit taken. I think San Domingo is no different than any other community. And wherever you go, in my youth here on the shore, the community was held together by the church. We were raised with the thought that there's two institutions that were absolutely critical for the success of black people, and that was the church and the school. So if anything occurred within a community, it had to, I guess, I assumed, based on what I observed and what I was a part of, you were at the church or the school, those two institutions. And to some degree, to this day, even it's still that way. So the church was the center of the community. Uh, any crisis that occurred, you would find the whole community coming to church to discuss that. It wasn't a casual thing. Um, our whole day of Sunday started off with morning worship service. We had Sunday afternoon service at 3 o'clock Sunday in the afternoon, and that was expected. So every young person, every child in the community knew that on Sunday that was the course of events, and there was no discussion about it. So we had a robust Sunday school, and I guess it's unbelievable today. It's hard to get youth today to think about coming back to church at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but that was our routine. 3 o'clock in the afternoon was Sunday school. Every child in the community was in church at 3 o'clock in the afternoon with Sunday school. So Sunday morning, I remember coming here with my father for what in those days was class. And class was a period of time before service actually started, where most of the seniors would come in and have their testimonies and witnessing even before service started. And that was very early. But then you had the regular church service, and that was the emphasis of religious worship throughout my whole youth and adulthood. And I think throughout the whole history of San Domingo was that church held everybody together. And I do not believe we are unique in that regard because of our relationship with other black communities at the time. We visited many communities because we had the annual camp meeting during the summertime, where we would move from our home church to other churches to worship and to have a revival throughout the whole summer. And so even in those communities, the focus was on the church and in that revival service. So you hear the older people in our community still talk about the camp meeting days, where every community had a scheduled time for that revival or that camp meeting. And ours was always the first week in August. We knew that everybody in all the surrounding communities would be at Zion for camp meeting. And when we left here, we would go to Mount Nebo, which is here in Columbia, Delaware. And so it was throughout the whole summer, the community would be moving together to have this worship service. I learned later on from, I got fortunate to meet a superintendent in the Methodist Church, and we were talking about the camp meeting experience. And she shared with us that camp meeting was much more than a religious experience, a worship service, that it really was a way for the black communities to unite and renew acquaintances, and for people to find out how other people in their family were doing. So it was a question too of saying, do you know where someone is and how are you doing? It was more of that idea as well as the worship service. It held them together, held all these communities together as people spread out. So that was very important to me when I heard the superintendent share it from that standpoint. And I can see that occurring in my experience here in Zion and San Domingo, because we had people living in distant places would make an effort to be here for camp meeting. People living as far as New York, Philadelphia, Wilmington, for sure, would always know that they would be home for camp meeting. And that's a 3 or 4 day period of time. So I guess the question is the importance of the church in the community. I would have to say it has always been the nucleus in the black community. And if it's not the church, then you have to be the school. And education has always been very critical institution to us. And I think because our parents really were denied the opportunity to go to school because they were working, and they valued education as a way to have a better life. So we were always taught that the way to have a better life is to gain an education. We're very fortunate in the sense that we had school here in San Domingo where many black kids from surrounding communities and all came here for grade school. And of course, during those days, a period of segregation, we were then bused from San Domingo and surrounding to Salisbury High School for high school education. So we all went to Salisbury High School. That is the whole county. All black kids in the county at the time went to Salisbury until the period of integration. You know, and there's some, I don't know, I tell the youth today there's some fun things about that too, is that we not only got a great education because you had a great sense of concern for the welfare of the students, you had the families involved, the parents were totally involved in education in grade levels here in the elementary school and the community. I was always thinking about it now, the relationship between the parents and the teachers, I don't know how you could describe it. It was highly valued, I would say, critical. When you had the teachers living in the community to some degree, well, a lot of teachers lived here in the community in boarding houses, and they had a relationship with the families. You would see them oftentimes visiting with families after school, up until, I guess, up until the mid-60s, that was a spirit. And even in high school, there was this great concern that we had to be as successful, if not as good as better than the other schools, not only black schools or white children, in order to be successful. So you had that drive shared with us with our teachers. I never forget going to Salisbury High School when my teacher was asking us, did we have an aspiration to go to college? And some of us who were fortunate enough to go on to higher education were actually challenged at that point to the degree that you have to be better than your counterparts in the big cities in order to be successful. And so it was that determination, not only from our parents, that was a challenge given to us in order to be successful, coming from a country environment, that you had to excel, because we felt that, or we were given the idea that the schools in the cities were better than the schools in the country, or those students would be more academically superior than we would be, where we had this drive to excel. I give great credit to the teachers who taught in that area, because we were well prepared when we went to higher education. And of course, we're talking about being competitive in a segregated system. Because when we finished Salisbury High School, our idea was, for those of us who were fortunate to go, we didn't think outside of the state. We thought that we could go to Maryland State at the time, we could go to Bowie, we could go to Morgan State. And I don't think there's many of us, and I'm talking about up till mid-60s. I finished high school in 1962, and I know there were a few of us who maybe went to other schools if you were really successful, if you were really lucky and had the financial backing. I remember one of my classmates went to Hampton that I thought was highly unusual, and one of them got to Howard University that I thought was unbelievable. So for those of us who could go on to school, we looked at Bowie, because many of our teachers went to Bowie, being teachers. Bowie, at that time, we call it Bowie State Teachers College. Or you went to Maryland State, now the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, or some of us looked at Morgan State. And I think we looked at Morgan probably because of Morgan's influence into the Methodist Church, that we had this, we're leaning to Morgan because of our church presence here, being a Methodist church, and knowing that the influence of the Methodist Church in Morgan, and also many of our teachers were graduates of Morgan. So you had a double connection there. But anyway, we didn't really think, it was highly unusual for us to think outside of those three institutions as possibilities to get into a higher education. And that was monumental in itself. So fortunately, with working in the summertime with student aid programs or National Defense student loans, and that sort of thing. Some of us were able to go to higher education, but so it was great. And then you never ever got away from the influence of the teachers who work in that environment and the church being supportive of the youth from the community who are pursuing higher education, and that was very important. Still is. So we still try to encourage people from the community to pursue higher education. Circumstances might be different, but the fundamental reason to do it is still the same: to be successful and try to achieve a better quality of life. Because our parents were determined that their children would have a better way of life than they did, and the way they thought that was possible was through education.
And growing up in the community of San Domingo, education was very important, not only to us, but also to our parents, because it was with education that we had a bright outlook for our future. Now, being a black community, we all attended school here in San Domingo. And after completing elementary school, we then went on to Salisbury High School. It was when I was in the 6th grade that they moved the 7th grade to Salisbury High. And so we all attended Salisbury High. And I think that the change came to San Domingo when the school was integrated. Because once integration occurred, I feel that's when you got a change in the community. Up until that point, everything was self-contained here. And we took great pride in it. We knew our history. We knew we had to go on and work and strive. But with integration, we saw that our children were beginning to lose a connection to the past. We saw them forgetting the history of the community. We saw less pride, or students not seeing the value of an education. And we think part of that was because when we were close-knit, our teachers lived here, and they instilled within us that we could go on and be successful. And they drilled that in us, and so it became a part of us. Now, I went on to college and majored in education because I always had a desire to be a teacher. Why? Because our teachers were such excellent role models for us that many of us wanted to be just like our teacher. It was so positive. And we were so well prepared, even though we came from a rural setting. Now, I went on to Morgan State, but we were so well prepared that when we got there and we tested out on some of the 101 courses. And I believed in children, always wanted to teach, and that drive was there. And so I came back and tried to do my best to instill in my students the value of an education and why it was important to go on and be successful. And I might say now, I started teaching in the 60s. And as time went along, instilling in students the value of an education became more difficult. And I think that relates back to the home. Because growing up as we did in this community, even though we were segregated, see, I think our parents realized the value of an education Today, um, and even though some may disagree with me on this point, I think many of our young people they don't have the backing at home, or they don't have that support coming from home wherein parents instill in them how important it is to go on to get a higher education. And maybe it's because, we always say because they have so much, whereas we didn't have a lot. And as been mentioned before, we worked all summer in the field. And each day that we would go in the field, we would say, I'm not going to do this the rest of my life. And so that was always in front of us to move on a little higher.
Well, as we said a moment ago, the two institutions I think that the black community has always looked at in terms of critical was a church and a school. And our history here shows that San Domingo, I think, was a robust community and had to be for the size of school that was built here for grade school kids. I mean, we have what's called a 3-teacher school when you look at the archives of Rosenwald and Tuskegee Institute archives, which are now down at Fisk University. And when we studied that, we learned that the school was characterized as a 3-teacher school. Now that was I was curious why a 3-teacher school. Having gone there, I went to the elementary school here from 1950 to 1957. And quote, as I said, all black kids in San Domingo, Mardella, Hebron would have gone to this school here. So we really didn't know that it was a Rosenwald school until we started looking at how to preserve it. And I was asked a question by a lady from the Maryland Historic Trust when we tried to pursue a grant, were we dealing with the Rosenwald School? And lo and behold, we looked at the archives at Fisk University on Rosenwald to find out that there were 7 schools built in Wycomico County for the education of African Americans during that period of time. And sure enough, one is here in San Domingo. At that time, of course, they called it the Sharptown Colored School. But it's important, and I worked with Mr. Paul Tuart from Westover, who did an awful lot of work in documenting the information needed to make it for a national registry. What was indicated there was that the people here in San Domingo learned of Rosenwald's foundation and have petitioned the Board of Education to replace the one-room school here in San Domingo with a better school. The people donated the land, as I said, who are a descendant of James Brown, to donate the land. They donated the timber and the labor in building the school. That school was built in 1919, and it still stands today exactly the way it was when we all attended it. I guess the thing that I would say about the school being a 3-teacher school, which I found very interesting, of course that in itself stimulated me to look as much as I could about Rosenwald Foundation and the architect from Tuskegee Institute and the way they define how these schools should be built. And then I came back and looked at the school here in San Domingo to find that it has all those characteristics that the architects of Tuskegee define as being able to illuminate the classroom with natural lighting. So you have these huge banks of windows on the east and south side of the building. And also in the second floor, you have these bifolding doors that allow the school to be used as a meeting place for the community. It's interesting, and one of the footnotes in the information in the archives is that the school itself was intended to not only be a place for education or teaching, but also a meeting place for the black community. And thereby, these bifolding doors would give you an auditorium type environment. And so being a student there in the 50s, things of this nature were never dawned on us why it was the way it was. But now, after studying it it all sort of comes to life, and it's a great insight in the architecture fabric of the building, that the way it was designed, the way it was built, and so why it's so important for us to maintain it, because it does provide so much to the history of the black experience. So I guess the important thing to note that the relationship between Rosenwald, Julius Rosenwald, and Booker T. Washington was significant in the sense that the way the community and any other community got money to build those schools, it was a true partnership. There was a commitment from the community, contribution from the Rosenwald Fund, and then the third part was the public funds from the state or the county. And we had the same thing in this situation. I think, if I recall correctly, this school cost, I can't recall, close to $5,000 in the construction of it, with the donation of the lumber, the labor coming from the community, $600 from the Rosenwald Fund, and $3,000 coming from the Board of Education. I might have to verify those numbers, I can't recall. But the important thing was you had this partnership that had to exist in order to get a school. I guess in thinking about San Domingo, I think about the community when I was a teenager, and to think of the number of homes that were present, the number of families, and to think that, oh gee, you had as many, I'm going to say as many as 2,000 people living in this rural area. And many of the young people today, the youth of the day, raised the question about why it was never ever a town, so, or an incorporated development. And I share with them, I said, well, I think the answer to that is looking at it from a historical standpoint, in terms of the struggle that the people had, that is the African Americans that started the community, maintaining it, and they had to be more concerned about maintaining a lifestyle. And although the community was very robust, it was self-sufficient, and this great sense of cooperation and maintaining a relationship with the other communities, I think, was most important. And even when people came here to visit, it was interesting to note that we're so close to the community or the town of Sharptown and the town of Mardello or Riverton, that you have this pocket here called San Domingo. And if you look at the geography of it, I guess if you went north of here, 1.5 miles, you'd be in the town of Sharptown, and west of here, another 1.5 miles, you'd be in Riverton, and then further down the road, you'd be in Mardello. Well, I do not recall a situation where there was any sense of hatred between the communities, or people had harmony, I think is the best way to describe it. People from San Domingo actually went to Sharptown to do business, to do the shops, the bank, and also to work. But people lived in San Domingo, and the white people lived in Sharptown, and that was I can't think of any other word, the norm, or the status quo. And it stayed that way up until the 70s. And the community survived. And here in San Domingo, I think people accepted it. They worked together, but that part was never an issue, because the driving force was to do what you had to do to support your family and support your community. So that community spirit was always there. And I don't know, telling people how to get to San Domingo is always kind of interesting, because if you don't know where it is, you could actually get lost. So you got to know the lay of the land. And I think the the families that stayed here all those years, it's kind of really important to say how they survived, how they flourished, and even with the change in the economy, just in time, people tend to move out of San Domingo. They move to Salisbury or they move to Delaware because of economics, for jobs, as the agriculture industry changed, as the places to work changed, and the younger people moved away. And with them moving away, then you had a decline in the number of families that were actually here. But and I guess to this day, we have a lot of people that still come back here for worship service because their roots are here, but they live where the jobs are, so they're pulled away because of that, so to speak. But I find it a great place to live. I guess if I had to share one thing with you, I take people a lot of times to the graveyard to look at the history, because having the church here, as I said, as the nucleus or the center of the community, you can look at the graveyard and see the history of the community for the last 200 years, with the sons of James Brown buried here, and you can actually measure the generations with the children of the founding fathers all the way up to the present time, just by walking the graveyard. And even in my own family, I know that our great-grandfather, as I said, was John Quinton, and he's married to James Brown's granddaughter, Sarah. And so we go to the cemetery and look at their grave spots, and then we look at our grandfather, George O. Quinton, and his children. And then our father is here, George B. Quinton. And so we already have 3 or 4 generations here that we can track. And most families here in San Domingo can do the same thing just by going to the cemetery and looking at the generations that from the origin of the community up to the present. As I mentioned a moment ago, there's 2 institutions in the black community that have always been critical and still is: the church and the school. And I said many of us, I wouldn't say many of us, some of us were fortunate enough to go to grade school and then to high school and on to higher education. And in our family, I'm one of 8 siblings, and we're able to go to higher education. And the drive for that, I think, I know for sure, was from our parents to be able to have a better quality of life. And my parents always said, "I want you to have a life better than what I did." So after great sacrifice on their part, the drive to have a job and to save money and go to school was a driving force. Well, our oldest sister, this is after we were some adults and have, I guess, successful careers, depending upon how you define success. But we've been very blessed to be able to do that. Her concern was that we ought to do something to recognize the sacrifice and efforts of our parents to ensure that we were able to go to college. And so she had the idea that we should generate scholarships to assist other kids here in San Domingo and at Zion United Methodist Church to be able to go to school. And that was the catalyst that started the John Quinton Foundation, that as a family we ought to help other children here in the church to pursue a better lifestyle or go on to school. Not that other families were already doing it, but there's so many kids that may not have the drive or the finances to pursue education or really believe that they can. So it was a combination of all those things to encourage them to pursue education, do whatever we could to give them financial support, and to encourage them along that way. So we started the George B. Quinton Scholarship Fund for that reason, really following the desire on a part of our sister to do something to recognize the sacrifice made by our parents. We were very successful, and I think maybe the numbers might escape me, but maybe up to $15,000 were given in scholarship to some students here that were members of the Sunday school class here at Zion United Methodist, and we still pursue that as terms of making scholarship or awards for financial support to students from the community who are pursuing education. We're very fortunate to work with the Associated Black Charities in terms of looking at nonprofit organizations to apply for a grant to look at what we were doing in terms of our capacity for in rural communities development. That was very fortunate for us because we were able then to look at ourselves as an organization, what we were doing, and then try to see what else we could do in small communities like San Domingo to be a force or catalyst in helping people. Particularly, we were focused on small communities, preservation of our history and culture of African Americans, and then that expanded from a scholarship to the John Quinton Foundation, where we really look at other programs to help youth in developing life skills. And life skills could be a variety of things, but education is always prominent in that effort to pursue education. But more than that is just to be successful in school or to learn how to deal with circumstances they're faced with today in today's society, just being able to become successful. And I guess one of the things that we try to do also is to focus on history and culture, and that's why the school is very important to us as an institution, because it's a reminder of the sacrifice made by past generations to help us to be successful. And it should hopefully will become a culture center where we can continue to talk about the struggle and thereby be a catalyst to encourage people to move forward. So the foundation does well in assisting where we can within our resources, but more important, I think, is to give people the support that I know that we got, if not financially, just in encouragement that you can be successful and to overcome certain barriers just by having a drive to achieve a greater lifestyle. So that foundation is named, we expanded it from George B. Quinton Scholarship to John Quinton Foundation because we were making a connection back to the origin of the community. And as I said before, John Quinton, we can trace our roots back to John Quinton, who came here to San Domingo from the Caribbean, and he married James Brown's granddaughter. So we start there, hoping that other members of the Quinton family can also come on board and support the effort, because we know this is really where we can document our beginning back to using the census as that basis. So that's what keeps us focused.
With the John Quinton Foundation, we said that we would take on, along with that scholarship, a goal to instill in students the value of an education. And with that, and with funding from the Associated Black Charities, we tried to work with a tutorial program where we set up to tutor the kids so that they would also see a value of an education. At the same time, learn about the past and learn to appreciate it and to build on it.